You've seen the name 1,000 times, on signs, in books, on maps. But what if I told you that Arkansas isn't just a word, it's the echo of a people nearly erased, a language misunderstood, and a history layered deep beneath the surface? Sometimes, the most familiar places are the ones we understand the least. We pass by the names on road signs, maps, and monuments without realizing the layers of story beneath them, stories of people, language, erasure, and survival. Today, we're unlocking one of those stories, the name Arkansas. A word shaped by native identity, whispered in French syllables, and settled in American law. But its meaning runs deeper than spelling or sound. It holds the memory of a land, and the many lives that have called it home. 1. The original peoples and the word, Arkansas. Long before Arkansas became a state, or even a name on a colonial map, the land was alive with memory. Dense forests, winding rivers, and fertile valleys were home to people who had lived here for generations. To them, the land wasn't just a place. It was a story, a rhythm, a relationship. And one of the names carried through that ancient oral history was Arkansas. The origin of the word, Arkansas, doesn't begin with a state. It begins with the Quapaw people, a native nation belonging to the Degiha branch of the Siouan language family. They lived along the lower Arkansas River, in what is now southeastern Arkansas. But they never called themselves Arkansas. That name came from someone else. The Quapaw referred to themselves as Ugakpa, which means, the downstream people. Their identity was rooted in water, how it flowed, where it traveled, and what it gave. They saw the river as a living force, a highway of spirit and survival. It was the Illiniwek, a powerful confederation of tribes in the Mississippi Valley, who first referred to the Quapaw as Arkansas. In their language, it meant something similar, people of the south wind, or those who live downstream. The Illiniwek word was later misheard, misunderstood, and mistranslated by European explorers who relied on indigenous interpreters to guide them through unfamiliar lands. Then came the French. As 17th-century French explorers like Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet navigated the Mississippi River, they recorded the names they heard, not from the people themselves, but from neighboring tribes. When they encountered the Illiniwek pronunciation of the Quapaw, Arkansas, they wrote it down using French spelling conventions, adding an S at the end, as was common in their language. That spelling, Arkansas, was born not from a direct translation, but from layers of miscommunication between languages and cultures. Over time, the word took on a life of its own, becoming fixed on maps and in colonial records. The original name, Ugakpa, faded into the background. But for the Quapaw people, their identity was never lost. Despite being forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and relocated to what is now Oklahoma, the Quapaw Nation continues to carry their name, their stories, and their language forward. Today, Arkansas stands as a strange monument, one rooted in indigenous truth, yet filtered through the ears and pens of others. It's a reminder that names are more than sounds. They are history. They are relationships. And sometimes, they are echoes, fragments of stories told by people whose voices were nearly silenced. The name, Arkansas, may roll off the tongue without question today, but its roots reach deep, into the river, into the wind, and into the memory of a people who were always here. Because before Arkansas was a state, it was a name whispered by the river. A name for those who lived in harmony with it. The downstream people. The Ugakpa. 2. French influence and the spelling. Arkansas. The name Arkansas didn't begin with the French, but they're the reason we spell it that way. In the late 1600s, French explorers moved down the Mississippi River, driven by curiosity, trade, and the search for land to claim. As they navigated the unfamiliar waters and forests of the lower Mississippi Valley, they relied heavily on native interpreters, particularly members of the Illiniwek Confederation, to guide them through the region. That's when the French first heard the word, Arkansas. It wasn't the name the Quapaw people used for themselves. The Quapaw, an indigenous nation of the Siouan language family, called themselves Ugakpa, meaning, the downstream people. But their neighbors, the Illiniwek, referred to them as Arkansas, a word meaning something close to, people of the south wind, or simply, those who live downstream. The French, recording what they heard from their Illiniic guides, phonetically transcribed Akansa, using their own linguistic system. And in French, a final s is often added to plural nouns. That's how Akansa became Arkansas. But there's a twist. In French, that final s is silent. So they pronounced the word something like Arkansas. This French version, both in spelling and sound, began to appear in maps, missionary reports, and trade records. Over time, it became fixed in European and colonial consciousness. However, as English-speaking settlers moved into the region in the 18th and 19th centuries, they read the name with English rules in mind. To them, the word on the page looked like it should be pronounced Arkansas, and so, for decades, the state had two competing pronunciations, and sometimes, even two different spellings, depending on who was speaking and where they were from. By the early 1800s, confusion turned to controversy. Legal documents, newspaper editorials, and even schoolbooks debated how to say the state's name. Should it follow the French spelling? The indigenous pronunciation? The English reading? The debate finally came to an end in 1881, when the Arkansas General Assembly passed a resolution declaring the official pronunciation to be Arkansas, a nod to both the original French rendering and the indigenous roots from which the name came. Still, this story is more than a tale of spelling and sound. It's a reflection of how language travels, through trade, misunderstanding, and empire. How names get altered, adopted, and sometimes enshrined by law, even as their origins fade into history. And how the name Arkansas, born from native identity, reshaped by French ears, and settled by American law, remains a layered legacy, written in silence and sound. 3. American Anglicization and the pronunciation debate. By the early 19th century, Arkansas had officially entered American consciousness, but the way Americans pronounced it was anything but official. On paper, the name looked simple enough, Arkansas. But how you said it depended entirely on where you were standing. In some parts of the country, especially among newer settlers arriving from the east, it was pronounced Arkansas. A logical conclusion if you're applying standard English pronunciation rules. After all, why wouldn't you pronounce that final s? But locals, especially those tied to the older French and native influences, used a different version, Arkansas. It echoed the original French transliteration of the Illini word for the Quapaw people. In French, that final s is silent. And so, Arkansas, though it looked English, sounded French. The result? Widespread confusion. Teachers, politicians, and even judges pronounced the state's name differently. Newspapers mocked the inconsistency. Travelers often found themselves corrected, or corrected others, based on what they thought was proper. The divide reflected more than just phonetics. It revealed a deeper cultural clash between Anglicization and tradition. Should American English rewrite the rules of a name shaped by indigenous identity and French spelling? Or should the pronunciation respect the original path the word had traveled? By the late 1800s, this confusion wasn't just regional, it had become a matter of official concern. The need for uniformity, especially in education and government, became urgent. And so, in 1881, the Arkansas General Assembly took action. In a rare move, they passed a legislative resolution that settled the matter once and for all. The official pronunciation of the state's name would be Arkansas. The law didn't change the spelling, it simply insisted that the final s remain silent. This decision cemented the French-influenced, historically rooted version as the correct one, even though the name still looked confusing to anyone new to it. To this day, Arkansas remains the only U.S. state with a legally defined pronunciation. It's a curious distinction, one that reminds us how deeply language, identity, and politics intertwine. And still, behind that silent s lies a trail of voices, Indigenous, French, and American, each leaving a mark on a single word. What seems like a simple name is actually a complex narrative of cultural contact, colonial layering, and the stubborn nature of memory. In Arkansas, the debate may be over. But the story the name tells? That continues, every time we say it. 4. The official pronunciation law. In the swirling confusion of post-Civil War America, most people had far more pressing concerns than how to pronounce a state's name. But in Arkansas, one question refused to go away. Was it Arkansas, or Arkansas? On maps, the state looked simple enough, Arkansas. But how you pronounced those letters varied wildly, not just from region to region, but sometimes from person to person. Some pronounced the final S loudly and confidently, following typical English rules. Others dropped it entirely, speaking the name with a softer, French-inspired cadence, and neither side would budge. On one hand, you had newcomers and settlers from eastern states or neighboring Kansas, who looked at the spelling and said, Arkansas, just as they pronounced Kansas. It made sense, linguistically speaking. On the other hand, longtime residents, historians, and indigenous descendants understood the deeper origin of the name. Arkansas had come from the French interpretation of a native term, specifically from the Illiniwek word, Akansa, describing the Quapaw people, meaning, people of the south wind, or downstream people. The French had added their own spin, spelling it Arkansas, but pronouncing it Arkansas, with a silent S. The conflict was more than phonetic. It was cultural, a tug of war between anglicized logic and historical lineage. By the late 19th century, the debate became so heated and so widespread that it reached the floor of the state legislature. Enough was enough. The confusion was affecting public education, public records, and even court cases. And so, in 1881, the Arkansas General Assembly passed a resolution, a rare and unusual move in American governance. They would legally define the pronunciation of their own state's name. The resolution read, "Be it therefore resolved by both houses of the General Assembly, that the name of this state shall be pronounced in 3 syllables, with the final S silent, the A in each syllable with the Italian sound, and the accent on the first and last syllables being the correct pronunciation. In plain English, it's Arkansas, not Arkansas, not Arkansas, not anything else." The law didn't change the spelling. It didn't rewrite history. But it did something powerful. It honored the complex origins of the name. The indigenous roots, the French spelling, and the American story all collided in that one word. And the legislature chose to protect it, not by changing it, but by declaring how it should be spoken. Today, Arkansas remains the only U.S. state with an official, legally mandated pronunciation, a strange but fascinating footnote in American legal history. And yet, that one law speaks volumes. It reminds us that names carry weight. That history isn't just found in monuments and textbooks, but in the syllables we speak every day. In that silent S lies a legacy of culture, colonization, and compromise. So the next time someone mispronounces it, you'll know. It's not just about saying it right, it's about remembering why it matters. 5. The erased and remembered. The name, Arkansas, is etched into license plates, highway signs, and American memory, but the people it was named for? Their story is less visible. Long before maps labeled the region, the Quapaw Nation lived along the lower Arkansas River. They called themselves Ugakpa, meaning, the downstream people. Their lives were deeply tied to the rhythm of the land, the rivers they navigated, the forests they hunted, and the sky they read like scripture. They had villages, complex social structures, and sacred ceremonies that stretched back generations. But when French explorers arrived in the 1600s, they didn't ask the Quapaw what they called themselves. Instead, they listened to what other tribes, like the Illiniwek, called them, Akansa. A word that was eventually misspelled and reshaped into Arkansas by colonial scribes. And so, the state's name was born, not from direct translation, but from layered misunderstanding. A borrowed word. A misheard identity. A name that masked a people even as it honored them. But the irony runs deeper. In 1818, just decades before Arkansas became a state, the Quapaw signed a treaty with the United States government. Under pressure and threat, they ceded most of their ancestral land. And in the years that followed, they were forcibly removed, pushed westward to present-day Oklahoma during a period of violent expansion and betrayal known across Native history as removal and relocation. The people the state was named after were no longer allowed to live freely on their own land. Over time, their presence was pushed into the margins of memory. Schools didn't teach their language. Laws didn't protect their traditions. And maps, ironically, kept their name, even as their culture was erased from view. But erasure is never the end of the story. Today, the Quapaw Nation is thriving in northeastern Oklahoma, where they've rebuilt much of what was lost. They run health programs, community centers, and economic ventures. They're restoring their language, reviving their ceremonies, and reclaiming their sovereignty. They're telling their own story, on their own terms. And slowly, the state of Arkansas is beginning to listen. Efforts are underway to acknowledge the original peoples of the land. Historical markers are being placed. Tribal collaborations are increasing. And more Arkansans are learning that their state's name is more than a word, it's a legacy. A legacy of survival. Because while the Quapaw were once pushed aside, they were never broken. The name, Arkansas, stands as both a reminder of what was taken and a signal of what still endures. So the next time you hear the name, pause. Not just to pronounce it correctly, but to remember who it came from. Because the truth is simple. You cannot erase a people by removing them from a map. As long as memory lives, as long as language is spoken, the Ugaukpa live on. Erased by history, but remembered by the land. 6. Arkansas is a symbol of cultural layering. At first glance, the name Arkansas feels simple. A word. A place. A point on a map. But like the sediment carried by its winding rivers, the state's name is layered, built over time by culture, conflict, language, and survival. To understand Arkansas is to understand that no name in America exists in isolation. This one carries the weight of multiple civilizations, all leaving their mark on a land that never stood still. The first layer begins with the Quapaw, the indigenous people whose lives were interwoven with the land and water. Their name for themselves, Ugaukpa, meant downstream people, a name that wasn't about territory or ownership, but about relationship. To them, land wasn't something to possess. It was a sacred partner. The rhythms of nature were not obstacles, they were truths. But the world was changing. The second layer came with the Illiniwek, another native group who lived farther north. When they spoke of the Quapaw, they called them Akansa, a name that carried their own linguistic filter. It was never meant to label a state. It was a reference point between peoples, an oral direction passed between generations. Then came the French. Explorers like Marquette and Joliet, navigating these new territories in the 17th century, heard Akansa through their native guides. They transcribed it the only way they knew, adding their own grammar, spelling it Arkansas, and giving it a French pronunciation with a silent S. They didn't invent the name. They simply reshaped it, unintentionally creating a version that would stick for centuries. When the Americans arrived, they layered on something new. Confusion. With English rules applied to a French spelling of a native word, settlers began saying, Arkansas. Others clung to the older, Arkansas. What followed was decades of debate, legal disputes, and regional division, until 1881, when the state legislature passed a resolution declaring Arkansas to be pronounced Arkansas, silent, S, and all. That law didn't just clarify a sound, it captured a story. One name, 3 languages, countless histories. Arkansas became a symbol of cultural layering, where indigenous identity, French exploration, and American settlement all collided in a single word. And that collision, though subtle, tells a much bigger story. It's the story of how place names in the U.S. often mask deeper truths. How indigenous roots are buried under colonial scripts. How languages bend under pressure, yet never fully break. And how memory survives, even when distorted. Today, Arkansas stands as a reminder that every state name, every town, every river has a deeper voice beneath it. Sometimes it's heard clearly. Sometimes it's muffled by centuries of conquest and change. But it's always there. To say, Arkansas, is to speak not just a name, but a history. Layered, complicated, and alive. The name Arkansas may seem like just another dot on the map, but behind that single word lies a legacy of complexity, culture, and quiet resilience. It reminds us that our history isn't made of straight lines, it's layered, messy, and deeply human. If this story moved you, help others find it. Like this video, subscribe for more hidden histories, and share it with someone who's never heard the name Arkansas this way before. And in the comments, let us know, what stories do you think are hiding behind the names we take for granted?